This is episode 3 of Watchman Tales. Welcome to Watchman Tales, where we bring you the darkest mysteries and chilling stories from around the world. Tonight, prepare yourself for 10 terrifying tales that will keep you awake long after the lights go out. We begin with a story that was recently shared with us, a true account of a house that held a secret far older and more sinister than its foundations. The Clockwork Static. The house stood on a hill overlooking the Pacific, a magnificent example of Victorian architecture, but with an unsettling silence that seemed to absorb all sound. Elias Thorne inherited it from a distant, unknown uncle, a man who had been a recluse, rumored to be obsessed with the mechanics of time and the measurement of things unseen. Elias, a practical man, a civil engineer, was only interested in its market value. The moment he stepped across the threshold, however, the air changed. It wasn't cold, but it was heavy, like the pressure before a deep sea dive. The house's most peculiar feature was the clock room, a turret-like space on the third floor. It wasn't just a room with clocks, it was a sanctuary of clocks. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, shelf to shelf, hundreds of timepieces, grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, pocket watches, ship chronometers, astronomical clocks, all stood motionless, their hands frozen at precisely 3:07 a.m. The entire room smelled of ozone and ancient brass. Elias tried to restart a few, winding the mechanisms, but their pendulums would swing twice and then stop with a soft final click. The real mystery began with the static. It was a sound you could feel more than hear, a constant, low-frequency hum like a distant power station struggling for life. It was loudest in the clock room, but it permeated the entire structure. One evening, while examining a strange, gear-driven automaton built into the mantelpiece, Elias found a hidden switch. When he flipped it, the automaton didn't move, but the low static intensified, vibrating the glass in the windows. He flipped it off, and the static dropped back to its background hum. Later that week, he hired an electrician, a man named Marcus, to check the wiring. Marcus found nothing wrong with the electrical system, which was surprisingly modern. But he did bring an old spectrum analyzer, one used to detect unusual magnetic fields. When they turned it on in the clock room, the needle went wild, spiking off the charts. "This isn't electricity, mate," he muttered, his face pale. "This is a massive amount of highly focused, non-repeating energy. It's like a temporal distortion field." He dismissed it as nonsense, but the events that followed were nothing but. He started finding small, anachronistic objects in the house. A coin from 1850 lying on the kitchen counter, which he'd scrubbed clean just hours before. A newspaper clipping from 1942 tucked inside a book that was published in 1980. These were not ghosts or apparitions. These were physical objects displaced in time. The unsettling feeling reached its peak when Elias finally started listening to the static with specialized noise-canceling headphones. The hum wasn't random. Deep within the white noise, like a trapped, frantic insect, was a rhythm. It was a pattern, a series of quick pulses and drawn-out tones, structured and repetitive. Elias realized with a sickening lurch that he was listening to a code. Using an old Morse code reference he found in the study, he painstakingly began to transcribe the pulses. The code was complex, disjointed, and seemed to be the raw, terrified ramblings of someone or something in extremis. One sequence, repeated over and over, was terrifyingly clear. Not this time. Not this time. Not my time. Then came the coordinates. A long string of numbers that, when plugged into a map app, pointed not to a location on Earth, but to a position in deep space, a point near the Triangulum Galaxy. The clockroom became his obsession. He realized the hundreds of clocks weren't just decorative. They were a complex kinetic energy sink built to harness the temporal displacement. The hands, all frozen at 3:07 a.m., were a lock, a time when the displacement, whatever it was momentarily stabilized. One night, the low hum stopped completely. The silence was absolute, a crushing vacuum of sound that hurt his eardrums. Elias stood in the center of the clockroom, the hundreds of dark brass and wood frames reflecting the moonlight. Then, one by one, with a soft, lubricated whir, the pendulums began to swing. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was not synchronous. Every clock beat to its own rhythm, a cacophony of disorganized time. As the second hand on the nearest grandfather clock swept past 3:07 a.m., the air cracked. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the sound of fabric ripping, only this fabric was space-time itself. He saw it, a momentary shimmering hole in the center of the room. It was about the size of a doorway, and through it he didn't see another room or another place, but a chaotic, swirling mess of colors that defied physics. Reds that were too deep, blues that vibrated, and for a fraction of a second he saw a shape emerge from the chaos. It wasn't human. It was long, impossibly thin, and it moved with a jerky, insect-like grace, its head turning towards him. Then the clock mechanisms all clicked simultaneously, and every hand snapped back to 3:07 a.m. The shimmering hole vanished. The silence returned, more profound and terrible than before. Elias ran from the house that night. He never sold it. He couldn't, not knowing what he knew. He locked it up, moved to another state, and became a jittery, nervous wreck, constantly checking his watch, terrified of the hour of 3:07 a.m. He sent the information, the coordinates, the transcribed static, everything, to Watchman Tales on a flash drive labeled The Anomaly at 3:07. He believes the clock room wasn't designed to summon something, but to trap it, or perhaps to keep the door shut. And he is convinced that the static he was hearing was the thing on the other side, desperately trying to send a signal, trying to get its own time back. This story was shared to Watchman Tales by Elias Thorne, a man who knows that some houses don't just hold secrets, they hold back the darkness. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a former lighthouse keeper in Newfoundland who experienced isolation and terror at the edge of the world. The Sentinel's Light. The lighthouse was called Grimstone Tower, and its name was no exaggeration. It stood on a needle of black rock, 40 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, battered constantly by the North Atlantic. For Silas, the last keeper, the isolation was the appeal. He sought solitude after a life that had grown too complicated. He found silence, yes, but he also found an audience. His first year was routine, the relentless schedule of fueling the lamp, winding the clockwork mechanism, and logging the weather. The beam was a comfort, a rotating, sweeping blade of safety that cut through the endless dark. But one winter the storms came early, trapping him for months. It was during this period of absolute solitude that the silence began to speak. It started with the sound of knocking. Knock, knock, knock. 3 short, sharp raps on the thick metal door of the tower's base, usually around 2 a.m. At first, Silas dismissed it as the sea, a rogue wave or a heavy piece of driftwood striking the structure. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The knock always came from the same spot. One night he strapped on his foul-weather gear and descended the winding iron staircase, his lantern casting long, frantic shadows. He opened the heavy, bolted door, the one that stood between him and the howling chaos of the Atlantic. Nothing. Just the spray and the roar of the waves crashing against the stone. Yet as he was about to retreat, he heard it again, this time closer, emanating from the interior of the tower. Knock, knock, knock. Silas lived alone, and the knock was distinctly coming from the 3rd floor, near the storage room. He climbed back up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The storage room door was closed, as always. He listened. Silence. He tried to tell himself he was hearing things, that the ceaseless wind and the lack of human interaction were finally breaking his mind. But the audience grew bolder. He began seeing things in the periphery of the light, the glorious, powerful sweep of the great lamp. As the beam rotated away from the glass, leaving a half-second of blackness before it returned, he would catch a fleeting glimpse of motion, a shadow that didn't belong to the railing or the clockwork, a shape, tall, thin, with a head that seemed unnaturally small, standing right on the narrow walkway that encircled the lamp room. It always vanished the moment the light swung back. He checked the walkway obsessively, finding nothing but cold metal and the perpetual salt rime. There was no way to access the walkway without climbing the outside ladder, and in the freezing temperatures and hurricane winds, no person could survive the climb. The entity's appearance became a nightly ritual. Silas started timing the light's rotation, preparing himself for the terrifying half-second of black. He realized the figure wasn't just standing there. It was looking up at the light, almost like a worshipper or a supplicant. One evening he was changing the mantles, the intense, delicate task of maintaining the light's core. The storm outside was so loud it felt like the tower was inside a drum. As he looked into the parabolic reflector, a momentary pause in the rotation, he saw a reflection that wasn't his own. The reflector, a huge, multifaceted mirror designed to amplify the light, showed the room behind him, magnified and reversed. And in the reflection, standing right where he had just been working, was the tall, thin shape. Its face, or what passed for one, was smooth and pale, and its eyes were like chips of black ice fixated on the beam itself. Silas froze, his hand inches from the control valve. The reflection stayed. It didn't disappear. It was solid, terrifyingly present. The entity seemed to be absorbing the light, drinking it in. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It was waiting for the light to go out. He stumbled back, knocking over a canister of oil. The noise seemed to disturb the thing, and it turned its gaze from the lamp to him. Its mouth, a thin, lipless line, curved into something that was unmistakably a smile, a terrible, ancient expression of malicious hunger. He did the only thing he could think of. He slammed the control valve, sending the light into full, blazing intensity. The heat from the huge xenon lamp was immense, but the creature recoiled as if struck. It didn't scream, but the air around it shimmered, and it faded, dissolving back into the air just as the light completed its full rotation. The storm outside seemed to calm instantly, the wind dropping to a whisper. The silence returned, but this time it felt heavy, defeated. Silas left the tower at the first opportunity. He resigned his post and never looked at the ocean again without a shiver. He believes that Grimstone Tower was not just a sentinel for the ships. It was a prison for something ancient and vast in the depths of the Atlantic. The light, the endless rotation of the light, was the only thing that kept the entity from climbing the final steps. The knock, knock, knock he heard was its attempt to be let in. This unsolved mystery was submitted to Watchman Tales by Silas, the last keeper of Grimstone, who lives every day knowing that the Sentinel's light is still spinning against the dark. Now let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a former urban explorer who stumbled upon an impossible chamber beneath the streets of Bucharest.
The Black Cube of Bucharest. Andrei and his crew were urban explorers, or urbex enthusiasts, specializing in the labyrinthine underbelly of Bucharest, the forgotten tunnels, the abandoned Cold War bunkers, and the vast, forgotten sewage system that held the city's dark history. Their latest target was an unmarked manhole cover near the old University Square, rumored to lead to a network of pre-communist-era vaults. They descended into a deep brick-lined shaft, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. The tunnels were smaller than expected, not the massive storm drains they were used to. These were narrow, hand-dug passages, shored up with crumbling timbers, suggesting an immense age. After 3 hours of crawling and navigating, they found a structural anomaly. The brick wall they were following suddenly gave way to a sheet of smooth, perfectly black material. It was seamless, non-reflective, and strangely cool to the touch. They spent another hour carefully chiseling away the surrounding mortar. When the opening was large enough, they shone their powerful LED torches inside. The beam was instantly swallowed. It wasn't just dark, it was an absence of light, a visual vacuum. Andrei, the most experienced, squeezed through first. He found himself in a chamber carved from the same black, featureless material. It was a perfect cube, roughly 20 feet across, with no discernible seams, corners, or floor-ceiling division. The light from his headlamp was useless. It illuminated a perfect sphere of air around him, but the walls remained perpetually, intensely black. What was truly impossible was the sound. The air inside the cube hummed with a low, complex frequency, like a Gregorian chant played on an immense, broken machine. It was almost melodic, but profoundly unsettling. Then came the whispers. They weren't in any language Andrei knew, yet he felt them in his mind, not his ears. They were rapid, overlapping thoughts of immense age and cold, pure malice. His team followed. All 4 explorers instantly felt the mental pressure. They tried to communicate, but their voices sounded thin and distant, immediately absorbed by the blackness. Then came the object in the center of the cube. It was a sphere, about the size of a bowling ball, made of the same light-devouring material. It didn't sit on the floor. It hovered, slowly rotating, about 3 feet off the ground. As they stared at it, the mental whispers intensified, concentrating into a single, cohesive message that wasn't language, but pure concept. Observation is invitation. Suddenly, the sphere in the center of the cube began to change. It didn't move, but its surface seemed to unfold. Cracks appeared, lines of impossible geometry that didn't match any known Euclidean shape. The cracks bled a faint, icy blue light, and from the light emerged shapes. They were visual paradoxes, things that looked like hands but were made of shadow and fractured light reaching out of the floating sphere. The whispers in Andrei's mind were no longer concepts, they were demands, demands for recognition, for contact, for release. One of his team, a young man named Stephen, lost it. He let out a strangled cry, dropped his flashlight, and started running toward the wall, desperate to escape. He didn't find the opening. Instead, he struck the black wall with a muffled thud and slid down into a fetal position. Andrei, fighting a paralyzing fear, realized 2 things. The cube was perfectly soundproof, and the whispers were becoming louder the longer they stayed. He felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo, as if time itself was stretching and snapping around them. He grabbed Stefan, dragging him back toward the opening, but as he looked back at the sphere, the impossible light within it flared, and for a horrifying moment, the smooth black wall of the chamber dissolved. He saw not the earth or the city above, but a landscape of impossible gravity and color. A sky the color of dried blood, and structures that defied physics, built of shifting crystalline mass. And standing in that terrible landscape were things that made the reaching shadows seem benign. Vast, monolithic entities that stared not at him, but through him, with an indifference that was more terrifying than any hatred. The vision lasted perhaps a second, but it imprinted on his mind like acid. Then the wall returned, featureless and black. Andre and his crew scrambled back through the opening, barely pulling Stefan, who was now catatonic, after them. They sealed the hole with every brick and scrap of mortar they could find, and fled the tunnels. Stefan never spoke again. He sits in a clinic now, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at some distant, terrible geometry. Andre believes the cube wasn't built by any human. It wasn't a vault for treasure or a bunker for war. It was a compression chamber for something that shouldn't exist in our reality, and the black material was designed to absorb all energy, including light and sound, to keep it dormant. But the cube is old, and the seal is failing. And when the explorers breached the seal, the thing inside, vast and cold, learned that something warm and alive was nearby. The whispers are its signal, and the cube is its portal. This chilling account was given to Watchman Tales by a survivor who now dedicates his life to finding every unmarked manhole cover in Bucharest, terrified that another black cube lies waiting beneath the surface. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a man who discovered that a simple household mirror held a reflection of a life he was never supposed to have.
The Shard in the Wardrobe. It was a flea market find, an antique full-length cheval mirror, its wooden frame carved with grotesque, grinning faces that Elias found charmingly morbid. He bought it for his bedroom, positioning it on the wall opposite his bed. It was a beautiful piece, but it was flawed. A small triangular shard of the reflective surface, about the size of a playing card, was missing from the lower left corner, revealing the dusty, dark wood backing. The anomalies began subtly with the sound. When he was standing in front of it, shaving or tying a tie, he would occasionally hear a sound in the reflection that wasn't there in the room. A soft, distant female voice humming a tune he didn't recognize. Sometimes a child's faint giggle. Elias, a bachelor, lived alone. The real horror started when he began noticing inconsistencies in his reflection. When he looked directly into the mirror, everything was normal. But if he caught his reflection obliquely, just in the corner of his eye, the image staring back was slightly off. His reflected self wore a different shirt, a faded blue one instead of the gray one he had on. Or his hair would be styled differently, parted on the wrong side. He started experimenting, trying to catch the reflection in the act. He would stand perfectly still, then quickly snap his head to the side. For a millisecond, the reflected Elias wasn't alone. A figure, a woman with long dark hair, would be standing just behind him, her hand resting affectionately on his shoulder. Then, in the blink of an eye, she would be gone, and the reflection would be only him. He was looking through the mirror, not at his world, but into one that was nearly identical, but with one critical difference. The reflected Elias was married. The missing shard in the bottom left became his focal point. It was a window, a portal of observation, and the missing piece of glass was the only way for the two realities to touch. One evening, he came home exhausted and stripped down to a t-shirt. He saw the oblique reflection of himself walking past the mirror. The reflected Elias
was wearing a soft, gray V-neck sweater, and his face was drawn, tired, with dark circles under his eyes. Suddenly, the reflected Elias stopped in his tracks, not a reflection of his own movement, but an independent action. He turned slowly, his reflected face a mask of sorrow. He looked directly at the missing shard, and then his eyes, dark and despairing, looked past the shard, directly at the real Elias. The reflected man reached up and pressed his reflected hand against the mirror's surface, right where the glass was missing. He mouthed 2 words, his face contorted in pain. "She's gone." The real Elias froze, adrenaline searing his veins. He looked at his own hand, then back at the reflection, which was now trembling. The woman, the reflected wife, was not there. Terror turned to reckless curiosity. Elias walked up to the mirror, placing his own hand against the smooth glass opposite where the reflected Elias had placed his hand against the absent shard. He was staring now, full on, and the reflection was completely normal, just him, standing alone in his empty bedroom. But as he looked, the surface of the mirror where the glass was missing began to darken. It wasn't the dark wood he was seeing, but a swirling deep indigo. It was a hole, a dimensional tear the size of a playing card. He tentatively put his finger through the hole. The feeling was instantly wrong. It wasn't the rough wood backing. It was soft, cold, and yielding, like touching wet velvet. As his fingertip crossed the threshold, the air in the room grew heavy. The light dimmed, and the low, heartbroken voice of a man echoed from the mirror surface. "She's gone, and now you can't have her either." Elias recoiled, yanking his hand back. He looked at his finger, and though it was unharmed, his nail was stained with a small streak of deep, impossible black. He stared at the mirror. The reflection was normal again, the hole just showing the dark wood backing. But on the floor, directly beneath the missing shard, lay a small metallic object that hadn't been there moments before. It was a wedding band. Not his, but a woman's. Engraved inside were the initials ET to AV 2021. Elias Thorne was his full name. He understood now. The mirror was a dimensional slippage connecting 2 nearly identical lives. In the reflected world, Elias was married, and his wife, AV, was dead. And the reflected Elias knew his counterpart existed, knew that in this reality the woman was still alive, and he was consumed by a desperate, selfish grief. The reflected Elias had found a way to use the missing shard, the weakness in the dimensional barrier, to take a piece of his lost reality. And the wedding band was his warning, his proof, and perhaps his curse. Elias packed the mirror away in his attic, covering it with a thick, blackout cloth. But every time he passes the attic door, he hears a faint, dragging sound from inside. A sound that could be a man's tired footsteps, or perhaps a velvet dress brushing across the dusty floor. He never married. He is terrified of finding a woman with dark hair and the initial AV. She would be a ghost, stolen from another reality, and Elias knows the price of such a theft. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a man who now knows the terror of seeing the life you didn't choose and realizing that the other you is looking back with desperate envy. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a geologist who discovered that the Earth itself is not a silent solid shell, but a screaming, hollow shell. Dr. Alistair Finch was a deep Earth seismologist, specializing in interpreting the faint vibrational murmurs of the planet's interior. His equipment, deployed in a remote shielded bunker miles beneath the Mojave Desert, was the most sensitive in the world, capable of picking up a whisper in the planet's mantle. For years, the readings were predictable. The subtle whoosh of magma currents, the distant thrum of continental drift, and the sharp crack of deep-focus earthquakes. But 3 years ago, the data changed. A new signal appeared deep beneath the core mantle boundary, an impossible non-seismic event. It wasn't a tectonic plate movement. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sound. The signal was low frequency, almost infrasound, registering at 2 hertz, too low for humans to hear, but powerful enough to make his internal organs subtly resonate. When Alistair ran the frequency through sophisticated computer models to visualize the source, the results were devastating. The sound was originating from the exact geometric center of the planet, the solid inner core. The initial pattern was simple, a repetitive 2-tone pulse, like a massive mournful heartbeat. Alistair initially theorized it was a natural magnetic resonance phenomenon, perhaps a previously unknown reaction between the spinning iron core and the outer liquid layer. He was working on a paper to explain it when the pattern shifted. The 2-tone pulse became irregular, complex, and frantic. Alistair spent 6 months feeding the data into every cryptographic and linguistic algorithm he could access. The pattern wasn't random. It had structure, rhythm, and what appeared to be syntax. He eventually found a common factor. The pattern mirrored the complex acoustic structure of certain deep-sea whale songs, the calls used to communicate across thousands of miles of ocean. The Earth's core was communicating. When he amplified and sped up the signal by a factor of 100,000, it became audible. It was a sound of profound ancient suffering, a low, gargling wail, an endless, trapped scream that seemed to stretch from the dawn of time. Alistair realized he wasn't listening to a geological phenomenon. He was listening to the sound of something imprisoned at the center of the world. He tried to share his findings, but his colleagues dismissed the audible playback as software artifact, and the core location as seismic noise interference. They demanded raw data, which, when presented, was too complex for anyone without his specialized knowledge to interpret as anything but noise. Isolation pushed Alistair deeper into his research. He discovered that the sound, this echoing core, was not constant. It would build to a terrifying crescendo and then abruptly stop for hours, sometimes days. During these silent periods, the planet's magnetic field would experience a tiny, almost imperceptible drop in strength. He deduced that whatever was trapped in the core was feeding on the planet's magnetic field, using the energy of the Earth itself in its desperate attempt to signal for help, or perhaps for escape. The terror reached its peak when Alistar began correlating the sound events with external data. The moments when the core's scream reached its highest intensity, the chaotic, frantic wails, were always followed within 48 hours by a massive, catastrophic earthquake somewhere on the surface. Not caused by plate friction, but originating from an impossible depth, a sudden, violent surge of energy from the core. The trapped entity wasn't just screaming, it was thrashing. Alistar wrote a final, terrified log entry. He theorized that the solid inner core was not a naturally formed structure, but a containment mechanism, a high-pressure, superheated prison built eons ago to lock away something that threatened the very fabric of existence. The constant, predictable magnetic field was the key to its slumber, its lock. But the prison was weakening, and the prisoner was waking up. The last data point he recorded was the most horrifying. During a recent silent period, the echoing core wasn't completely mute. A new frequency appeared, a faint, high-pitched whine at the edges of the main signal. Alistar sped it up, ran it through a vocalizer, and recognized the pattern. It was a rhythmic, rising and falling tone, nearly identical to the warning system of his own deep Earth seismometer. It had learned the language of its captors. The core was no longer just screaming, it was beginning to send out organized, coded signals. Signals that could only be interpreted as, "I am here. The lock is failing. Prepare." Alistar sealed his bunker and his data. He is currently in an undisclosed location, staring at the seismograph readings from a university's public feed, waiting for the next sign. He knows the ultimate catastrophe will not be an earthquake, but the complete, sudden silence of the core's scream, the moment the prisoner finally steps free from its iron cage. This is the terrifying record of Dr. Alistar Finch, who learned that when you listen closely to the earth, you can hear its terrified pleas. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a man who found that some family curses are not genetic, they are physical, passed down in the form of a terrifying heirloom.
The portrait of Alistair Cross, the 17th century progenitor of the Cross family line, was not a flattering work of art. It hung in the ancestral manor's smoking room, a dark, looming figure rendered in oil on ancient canvas. The subject was pale, thin, and possessed eyes of a startling, cold gray that seemed to follow you regardless of where you stood. For centuries, the portrait had been the center of the Cross curse. The family's firstborn sons, the direct heirs, all died young, always before their 30th birthday, and always by a gruesome, unexpected accident, a fall from a horse, a sudden illness,
a hunting rifle misfiring. The family believed the curse was simply bad luck, an unfortunate genetic predisposition to short, violent lives. When Elias Cross inherited the manor and the portrait at age 25, he was a skeptic. He was also the current heir, and his 29th birthday was fast approaching. The portrait became his immediate concern, not because he feared the curse, but because he swore it looked different every time he passed it. He would stare at it, confirming the position of Alistair's hands, the fold of his velvet doublet. But when he returned hours later, something would have subtly shifted. A shadow on the cheek deepened. The mouth's slight sneer seemed more pronounced. The position of a finger on the hilt of a decorative rapier changed by a fraction of an inch. He decided to test it. He took a high-resolution photograph of the portrait and printed it. He then taped a thin piece of thread across the canvas, directly over the rapier's hilt, a definite marker. The next morning, the thread was broken, lying on the floor beneath the painting, and the rapier in the portrait was no longer hanging on his hip. It was held, slightly forward, in Alistair's left hand. He called in an art restorer, a meticulous older woman named Agnes. She examined the painting, declaring it to be an authentic 17th century piece, but she made a terrifying discovery. Beneath the top layer of oil paint, the canvas showed evidence of severe, repeated damage. Tiny, puncture-like holes, all converging toward the area of the eyes. Agnes theorized that the original painting had been repeatedly vandalized and then masterfully restored, perhaps dozens of times. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat in the smoking room, watching the portrait with a camera set to take a time-lapse photo every minute. He didn't want to blink. At 3:17 a.m., he saw it with his own eyes. Alistair Cross's eyes, those cold gray pools, didn't just follow him. They blinked. It was slow, deliberate, a terrifying movement of the eyelid, and then the eyes reopened, their gaze now locked on the camera. Elias was paralyzed. He watched the portrait. The figure of Alistair Cross began to visibly shift. The oil paint, the surface material of the portrait, was moving like wet clay. The rapier handing the rapier slowly began to scrape the point of the blade against the canvas, right where the painted rapier met the painted doublet. It wasn't a figure in the painting. It was a figure trapped behind the painting, using the oil and canvas like a fragile, dimensional veil. The rapier scraped a tiny circle, and then slowly a puncture appeared in the canvas, a small, dark, wet spot. The painted figure, its eyes wide and triumphant, was cutting its way out. Elias finally found his legs and ran to the portrait. He grabbed a fireplace poker and hammered the point of the blade. The sound was not the tearing of canvas. It was a sickening, wet thud, like striking bone. The figure in the portrait screamed, a sound that was silent but seemed to vibrate the air in the room. The figure recoiled, its painted face contorted in a silent, agonizing snarl. The rapier in the painted hand instantly disappeared, the tiny puncture hole sealing itself with a slick, black substance. Elias stood there, shaking, the poker in his hand. The portrait was still. Alistair Cross looked exactly as he had a week ago, rapier hanging on his hip, sneer faint, eyes following. The only difference was a small, nearly invisible, perfectly circular, black smudge on the canvas. Elias finally understood the curse. The family's firstborn male heirs were tied to the portrait through some dark, inherited pact. The portrait wasn't killing them. The figure trapped within was replacing them. Each heir's life force was used to strengthen the barrier, but also to provide a temporary body for the creature when the canvas finally failed. The puncture marks Agnes saw were the previous attempts by the thing to break through. Elias had 1 month until his 29th birthday. He didn't destroy the painting. He realized that the act of destruction might free the entity completely. Instead, he did something worse. He carefully painted over Alistair Cross's eyes, using a thick black lacquer, sealing the creature in perfect sightless darkness. Then he carefully removed the portrait from the manor, taking it with him. He sold the manor, severed all ties to his family, and lives a life of terrified anonymity, carrying the portrait, which he keeps wrapped in a lead-lined box and buried in his basement, wherever he goes. He knows the painted thing is still alive, still trapped, and still waiting. Every night he presses his ear to the concrete floor of his basement, listening for the faint, impossible sound of scratching on the inside of the box. He has chosen his fate, to be the last watchman, to carry the prison of his ancestor with him until his own natural death, ensuring no other heir is ever born into the cross line. This horrifying tale of an inherited evil was sent to Watchman Tales by a man who has traded a grand inheritance for a terrifying, lifelong duty. Now, let us move to the next story, which was sent to us by a meteorologist who tracked a weather system that simply should not exist.
The storm that was always there. Dr. Lena Hansen was a specialist in anomalous weather patterns, working at a small independent meteorological station in coastal Washington state. Her focus was on low-pressure systems, but one system, a constant presence on her satellite data for 4 months, defied all known science. It was a swirling vortex of low pressure, a perfectly circular 500-mile-wide storm cell that remained stubbornly stationary over the central North Pacific. It had no eye, no discernible wind shear, and generated no precipitation. Its signature was a massive, unnatural absorption of atmospheric energy. It was a weather system that acted like a black hole for wind and moisture. The system was designated the Whisper by her team because its only observable effect was an intense, unnatural silence. Air traffic was automatically diverted 50 miles around its perimeter because pilots reported an unsettling total loss of radio static when they approached, along with a suffocating calm that terrified them. Lena started studying the archived satellite imagery. She traced the storm's path back using decades of historical data. The storm had no beginning. It didn't form. It was simply there.
In every high-resolution satellite picture of the North Pacific since 1968, a fainter version of the whisper existed, always in the same spot, always swirling slowly. In older, lower-resolution imagery from the 1940s, the faint spiral was still visible. It wasn't a temporary weather pattern. It was a permanent geographic feature that the human brain seemed to constantly filter out, like a blind spot. She realized the whisper wasn't moving. The Earth was moving under it. The scientific implication was staggering. The whisper was not a system of air and water, but a stationary non-terrestrial anomaly in the planet's orbit, or perhaps a permanent hole in the atmosphere held open by an unknown force. Lena chartered a small, independent research vessel, ignoring her superior's warnings, and sailed toward the center of the anomaly. The closer they got, the stranger the physical effects became. The water flattened into a glassy, unsettling stillness. The compass spun wildly, then locked solid. All the crew members complained of intense headaches, followed by periods of profound, blissful calm that felt profoundly wrong. When they entered the edge of the circular perimeter, the first mate looked up at the sky and screamed. The sky inside the whisper was not blue or gray. It was a pale, milky white, featureless and absolute. And the sun, the immense, burning star, was a dull, cold, copper disk, entirely without heat or brilliance. Lena brought up her advanced atmospheric sensors. The data was nonsensical. The air temperature was normal, but the pressure was impossible. A perfect, uniform 900 millibars across the entire area, not rising or falling. And the most terrifying reading, the oxygen-nitrogen ratio was correct, but the air contained trace elements of 3 heavy, stable isotopes of elements not found naturally on Earth. They were breathing alien air. They sailed toward the geographic center, which their instruments confirmed was completely silent. The only sound was the faint lap-lap of the boat against the eerily still water. When they reached the center, the water beneath the boat suddenly darkened. It became a perfect circular pool of black, glassy material that reflected nothing. Not the boat, not the copper sun, not the milky sky. It was a vertical cylinder of absolute absence extending down into the deepest abyss. As they drifted over it, the low, powerful headache returned, but this time it was accompanied by a sound. It wasn't in the air. It was a noise transmitted directly into the skull, a soft, whispering shh. It was the sound of a parent hushing a child, but immensely deep, ancient, and possessive. Lena looked down into the black water. The surface was perfectly still, but a single massive bubble of black gas, the size of a car, slowly detached from the depths. It drifted up, agonizingly slow, and burst silently on the surface. As it burst, Lena felt a momentary, impossible sense of absolute, perfect understanding. a knowledge of everything that ever was and everything that will be. And the knowledge was pure, crushing despair. She ordered the boat to full throttle, screaming at the crew to flee. They raced away from the dark circle, leaving the whisper perimeter just as the sun reappeared, warm and golden, and the wind returned with a sudden, violent jolt. Lena retired from meteorology. She believes the whisper is not a storm. It is a permanent anchor point, a massive hidden machine that is slowly, subtly altering our atmosphere to suit a foreign biology. It is silent because it has no wind, no rain, and no lightning. It is a vacuum, and it is here to stay. She now watches the satellite feeds every day, waiting for the circular vortex to expand, knowing that the soft, comforting shh she heard in her mind was the sound of the planet being silenced. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a scientist who learned that some weather systems are not natural events, but are the first signs of a slow, persistent invasion. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a man who discovered that a forgotten highway rest stop was a terminus for more than just human travelers.
The service road to nowhere. The old rest stop was situated 20 miles off Interstate 80 in rural Nevada, accessed by a crumbling service road the locals called the Spine. It was long abandoned, its bathrooms boarded up, the vending machine shattered. Liam, an over-the-road trucker on a tight schedule, only stopped there because he was exhausted and his GPS inexplicably refused to show the spot as a location. He pulled his 18-wheeler into the cracked asphalt lot. The air was unnaturally cold for the desert, and the silence was profound. No crickets, no wind, no traffic sounds from the distant interstate. Just silence. He climbed into his sleeper cab and fell into a deep, heavy sleep. He woke abruptly to the sound of an engine. It was an idling sound, deep and resonant, unlike any truck he had ever heard. He peered through his cab curtain. Another vehicle had pulled in, directly next to his rig. It wasn't a truck. It was a bus. It was long, black, and utterly featureless, with no windows, no visible doors, and no license plates. It wasn't painted. It looked as if the metal itself had been chemically darkened to absorb all light. The only illumination came from a single, sickly yellow light fixture above the driver's side, casting a faint, jaundiced glow. The engine was idling, the sound a low, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum that vibrated in Liam's teeth. Then the bus seemed to exhale. A ramp, also black and featureless, slid silently out from the center of the vehicle's side, leading down to the ground. Liam watched, petrified, as a line of people began to file off the ramp. They were all dressed identically, in long, gray, monastic-looking robes. Their hoods were drawn, concealing their faces. They moved in perfect, measured synchronization, not speaking, not looking left or right.
They were unnaturally thin, their bodies skeletal beneath the robes. They didn't head toward the rest stop building. They walked, single file, straight toward the back of the deserted parking lot where the asphalt ended and the desert began. Liam counted 22 figures. He waited, holding his breath, for them to disappear into the darkness. After a minute, he heard the faint sound of desert sand crunching underfoot. Then, silence. The bus continued to idle, its thrum, thrum, thrum seeming to grow louder in the absence of other noise. Then the figures returned. They walked back from the desert, still silent, still synchronized, but they were no longer empty-handed. Each figure was carrying something. It was long, cylindrical, and wrapped in a thick, waxy white material. The objects were the size of a human torso. They held them carefully, cradled in both arms. As they filed back up the ramp, Liam strained his eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of what they were carrying. The yellow light of the bus driver's fixture caught the edge of one of the objects. It wasn't smooth. It had a texture, a whirled, intricate pattern, like a petrified seashell or dried, calcified flesh. The last figure ascended the ramp, which silently retracted into the black metal of the bus. The idling engine cut off with a sudden, final snap. Liam waited another 5 minutes in the crushing silence. Then, with the sound like tearing aluminum, the black bus simply vanished. It didn't drive away. It was there, and then it was gone. Liam, desperate to find an explanation, checked his phone. It was 3 a.m. He grabbed his strongest flashlight and ran to the spot where the bus had been. There was no oil leak, no tire marks, no depression in the asphalt, only the normal dust of the lot. But just at the edge of the desert, where the procession had turned, he found something small, dropped by one of the robed figures. It was a gray cloth, like a glove, but too long and thin to be human. It smelled powerfully of ozone and something else, a musky, faint odor of burnt salt. Liam took the glove back to his cab. He started his engine and sped out of the rest stop, not even bothering to look in his rearview mirror. He never stopped at an unmarked spot again. Months later, driven by fear and curiosity, he researched the area. The old rest stop, he discovered, was built on the site of a long-abandoned government experimental facility from the 1950s, rumored to have been shut down after an incident involving a power failure and the disappearance of 7 employees. Liam believes the rest stop is a terminal, a dimensional interchange for travelers who aren't human, and the robed figures are not passengers. They are a crew arriving to pick up cargo. The black bus is the transport, and the mysterious, calcified objects they carried were not things found in the desert, but objects left behind by the previous vehicle, a harvest of something that grew only in the unnatural silence of that location. He still has the glove folded in a plastic bag beneath his seat. Every now and then, late at night, when he's driving on a perfectly smooth highway, he feels a slight vibration in the cab floor. A low, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum. He drives faster, never looking to see what vehicle might be idling just behind him. This horrifying tale was submitted to Watchman Tales by a weary traveler who learned that the desert holds secrets that are not of this earth, and some rest stops are built on the terminus of the unknown. Now let's move to the next story that was sent to us by a man who discovered that a vintage vinyl record held a song that could only be heard by the dead.
The seventh track of The Morning Star. Elias was a record collector specializing in obscure, single-run pressings from the late 60s. His greatest find was a near-mint copy of an album called The Morning Star by an unknown folk horror artist named The Seer. The album cover was a simple black field with a crude hand-drawn star, and the only track listing was 6 titles, all mournful, atmospheric, acoustic pieces. He placed the vinyl on his antique turntable. The sound was perfect, the songs eerie but beautiful. When the needle lifted after the 6th and final track, Elias prepared to flip the record. But the needle didn't lift. It settled back down onto the vinyl, right where the blank runout groove was supposed to be, and a 7th track began to play. It wasn't a song. It was a raw, unfiltered sound that Elias instinctively knew was wrong. It was a high-frequency, complex tone interwoven with a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks like a metronome set to a frantic pace. It sounded like an auditory panic attack. Elias tried to lift the needle, but his hand trembled. He was suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of crushing, hopeless grief, not his own, but projected onto him. He felt the cold touch of absolute despair and the vivid, instantaneous memory of every death he had ever known, not just people, but pets, even insects. The sound played for exactly 30 seconds and then stopped, the needle finally lifting. Elias sat in stunned silence, the grief slowly retreating, leaving behind a cold sweat and a profound feeling of violation. He examined the record under a strong light. The blank runout groove was not blank. Microscopic inspection revealed that the vinyl had a 7th, incredibly fine groove cut into it, so faint it was nearly invisible, running right up against the label. It was a groove cut by a hand that knew how to violate the limits of the medium. He played the 7th track again. This time he set up a spectral analyzer. The analysis confirmed the sound's complexity, showing multiple overlapping frequencies, some in the ultrasonic range, designed to bypass the ear and resonate directly in the inner ear cavity. He also recorded the track. When he played the recording back, the sound was muted, thin and harmless, just a series of faint clicks. The power of the sound was not in the recording. It was in the physical, direct vibration of the antique needle on the esoteric groove. Driven by a morbid fascination, Elias played the 7th track a 3rd time. This time he heard something new in the high-frequency tone, a faint, desperate voice repeating a single name, Sarah. The next morning, his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, rushed over in a panic. Her dog, a 10-year-old terrier named Monty, was acting strangely.
Monty was a placid, docile dog, but he was now cowering under the sofa, whimpering, staring into the center of Elias's living room with wide, terrified eyes. Elias played the seventh track again, very faintly through his closed living room door. Mrs. Peterson didn't hear it, but Monty, from inside his apartment, let out a single, sharp, unmistakable howl of pure anguish, followed by silence. Elias realized the true purpose of the seventh track. It was a beacon. It was a song that could be heard by beings not tethered to the living world, the dead, the dying, or things that exist between the two. And when it played, it drew them to the center of the sound. The rhythmic clicks were not a metronome. They were a lock being opened. He never played the track inside his apartment again. He took the record to a soundproofed basement, wrapped it in lead foil, and stored it inside a heavy, reinforced steel safe. But he still gets the feeling. Whenever he is near the safe, he feels the cold press of that desperate universal grief. And sometimes late at night, he hears a soft, insistent tap, tap, tap coming from the basement. A sound that is not metal on metal, but a faint, rhythmic tapping that seems to echo the clicks of the vinyl groove. This story was submitted to Watchman Tales by a collector who learned that some rare records are not just works of art, but are complex, engineered invitations to the other side. Now let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by a demolition engineer who discovered that the blueprints for an old hospital were missing one entire floor.
The sub-level that wasn't. Elias Vance was a demolition engineer, and his latest job was overseeing the dismantling of the old St. Jude's Hospital, a sprawling, forgotten structure built in the 1920s. His crew was following the original blueprints to the letter, mapping the structure's core for the controlled implosion. The blueprints showed 3 levels below ground. Sub-level 1, laundry and kitchens. Sub-level 2, boiler room and morgue. And sub-level 3, vaults and record storage. The crew found and mapped all 3. But as they were finishing the mapping of the sub-level 3, their seismic scanners, designed to penetrate deep into the bedrock, picked up a strong, unmistakable anomaly. There was another floor beneath the 3rd sub-level. It was a large, fully structured level, roughly the size of the morgue above it. It didn't appear on any of the blueprints. Elias checked the original architect's plans, the city permits, the construction logs. Nothing mentioned a 4th sub-level. It was structurally impossible. The foundation drawings showed solid bedrock immediately beneath the 3rd sub-level's concrete floor. Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, Elias ordered his team to drill. After 6 hours of agonizing labor, they punched a perfect 12-inch hole through the thick concrete floor of the records vault. When they lowered a powerful, submersible light on a cable, the light did not hit the bedrock. It illuminated an immense,
dark void. They lowered a tiny fiber-optic camera. The camera transmitted an image of a hallway. It was narrow, with low ceilings, lined entirely in a dark, glossy ceramic tile that looked like polished obsidian. The air was perfectly still, devoid of dust. The most unsettling detail: the ceiling was hung with hundreds of IV poles, all perfectly aligned, swaying gently in the camera's forced draft. The humidity reading was 0. The air temperature was 40 degrees below ambient. The sound reading was 0. It was a perfectly preserved, entirely sterile, impossible floor. Elias ordered a team of 3 to descend. They accessed the floor by carefully cutting a rectangular opening in the vault floor. The moment they dropped onto the sublevel, the connection with their helmet radios went dead, replaced by a blast of high-frequency static. The lights in their helmets, powerful LED arrays, dimmed instantly, as if a massive load had been placed on their battery packs. Elias, looking down into the pit, saw only the dim glow of their headlamps retreating down the long obsidian hallway, the IV poles catching the light. He waited 10 minutes. No contact. He was about to descend himself when the static on the radio suddenly cleared. He heard the voice of the team leader, Mark, loud and clear. "Elias, we're on sub-level 4. You can't come down. You need to seal this immediately." "Mark, what's down there? Report!" Elias shouted. Mark's voice was calm, almost dissociative. "It's a ward. Very quiet. They're all here. They're all waiting." Then the calm broke. A sharp, gasping inhale, followed by a choked whisper. "Elias, the poles are full. The bags are full. They just need to hook up. They need fresh. They just said they need a donation, Elias. Get out now." The radio went silent again, but this time Elias heard a new sound bleeding through the line. A faint, slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip that seemed to be echoing from hundreds of unseen vessels. Elias pulled the communication cable up. The camera at the end was swinging wildly, but the image was clear. The hallway was now full of movement. The IV poles were swaying violently, and standing at the end of the corridor, looking directly into the lens, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly gaunt, and wrapped head to toe in old yellowed hospital linens. Its face was entirely covered, but the bandages were soaked through with a deep, crimson fluid. And in the very foreground of the camera's view, discarded on the floor, were the 3 helmets of his missing crew, sitting neatly side by side. Elias sealed the hole. He didn't use a torch or cutting equipment. He ordered his crew to pour every bag of quickset concrete they had directly into the hole, burying the entrance forever. He didn't report his missing team. He reported a structural collapse on sub-level 3, citing old, faulty materials. He pushed the demolition through quickly. The hospital was imploded, collapsing into a massive pile of rubble. Elias is now in a different state, trying to forget, but he knows the truth. The impossible sublevel was not built for the patients of St. Jude's. It was a self-contained, subterranean ward for something that was not human, something that required constant, massive infusions to stay alive. The IV poles were not empty, and the final terrible terror. When the demolition crew drilled the hole, they didn't just breach the floor, they opened a delivery entrance. And the patients down there, those silent, gaunt figures, are now buried under tons of concrete and steel, still waiting for their next donation. But Elias knows the earth is not a perfect seal. One day, the crimson fluid will find a way up. This horrifying tale was submitted to Watchman Tales by a man who now knows the terror of a forgotten floor and the silent, hungry patients who resided within.
Which of these stories gave you chills tonight? Let us know in the comments. And remember, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Watchman Tales, or something may be watching you right now. Sleep well, if you can.